2018 on the initiative and donation of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. In the past 3 years, we have had the pleasure to support more than 3,500 young people, producers, farmers, graduates and professionals, and more than 100 small and family-run businesses, as well as startups, through the development of knowledge and the establishment of business acumen. We contribute to partnerships, the establishment of partnerships, the development of new products, and the development of new operations, having a broad network of partners that embrace the now network of the entire system of business and agriculture in Greece. Our action becomes imperative given the decisive position of the sector with regard to the food safety as well as the tackling of the climate crisis. According to recent studies, the food system worldwide seems to have the main responsibility for the loss of biodiversity and contributes more than 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. The climate crisis here is felt through increasingly intense and frequent climate phenomena such as cyclones, wildfires, etc. The chain reactions affect the price, quality and quantity of the produce and therefore the life and income of farmers. We have experienced the effects of the Ianos phenomenon firsthand when with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation we help the farmers to tackle the disastrous effects of the floods in September 2019. The Stavros Niarchos Foundation is currently helping Evia to restart the agricultural economy following the disastrous wildfires. In these days, in the context of COP26, the summit conference on climate change, leaders from 200 countries are meeting in Glasgow in an ultimate effort to coordinate the global action against the climate crisis. It is a commitment of ours to contribute to the fertile dialogue and the vulnerability of agriculture vis-à-vis the climate crisis, coupled with the role that they are called to assume in order to reverse this phenomenon, create a field of challenges in the agriculture, in the agri-food sector. Now, our conference in this direction will showcase and highlight not only the threats but also the potential opportunities that might arise for those sectors that will manage to respond effectively to the new challenges. 44 speakers from EU and the US represent, as well as representatives of the Ministry of Agriculture, FAO, the European Commission, the World Oceans Institute, academic and research institutes, as well as multinational Greek companies. The content and speakers of this conference have been determined by the organizing and scientific committee of this conference. I would like to thank Professor George Papadakis from the Agricultural University of Athens and its members, the members of the scientific committee of our conference. The lady is giving a list of the members of the committee. Prodromos Zanis, the lead doctor on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Mr. Maniatis, Zinia Morin, Associate Professor at Rutgers University, Panagiotis Balabanis, Deputy Head of Unit DJ Research and Innovation, European Commission, Kalliopi Pannoutsou, Senior Research Fellow at the Imperial College, and Vasilis Fenaki, Founder and Director of the Center of Life Analysis life cycle analysis at the Columbia University. We would like to thank the SNF, as well as our golden sponsor, Piraeus Bank, the Ministry of Rural Development and Food, as well as all the speakers and panelists from Greece and abroad. We would like to specifically thank our technical consultant, the Radcliffe University. A big thank and congratulations to my team, new agriculture, new generation that made this come true. Concluding, I'd like to wish the best for this conference, hoping that COP26 on the 12th of November will announce those optimistic commitments of the leaders that we all need. At this point, I'd like to ask Mr. Alkiviadis Alexandrou. I'm General Manager of Agricultural Banking at Piraeus Bank, to welcome this conference.
Dear Ms. Lazaridou, Mr. Papadakis, dear guests, good evening. Representing Piraeus Bank, we would like to extend our gratitude to New Generation New Agriculture for their invitation to be part of this so important conference, with the aim to shed light on all those impacts that derive from the global climate change. So 26% of the global CO2 emissions is related to the food production, whereas part of these emissions, 80%, is related to agriculture. In the Mediterranean, the main impact of the climate change in the agricultural sector, according to the European Environmental Agency, is expected to be a very increase of extreme temperatures, an increased risk for drought, increase in demand of water, reduced food crops, and threats to the sustainable growth. So sustainable development is a key parameter for Piraeus Bank, which is one of the 30 banks across the globe and the leader bank in Greece, which actually has co-shaped the United Nations Environment Program for Finance Initiatives as is. So those principles are adjusted to the United Nations and the Paris Agreement for Climate Global Pact. So the Piraeus Bank sees the climate change as one of the key challenges in our era and establishes the policies, the strategies, and the internal processes in its organization by adopting ESG criteria in its everyday working business. So actions and initiatives are undertaken by us in a better collaboration for our clients and our investors in order to support long-term sustainable investments, such as in the sustainability-linked loans with lower tariffs and fees, provided that sustainability indicators are observed throughout the loan period, special loans involving renewable energy sources for farmers, investment products such as mutual funds that invest only in companies based on the ESG criteria. Specifically, based on the emphasis that we place in the agri-food sector at the level of the Piraeus Bank as the par excellence bank on the agri-food sector, we feel that it is important for us to be present following the invitation of the Foundation Kapitana Vasilis Foundation, as well as following the initiative for the reconstruction and the rehabilitation of Evia by Stavros Benos, and participate in that in the framework of the various action under this committee. So we collaborate with the Agricultural University of Athens, with the fund Dimitra, as well as the American Agricultural School. Our objective is to showcase that the banking sector as well and the banking institutions needs to prove that in line with our role as bankers, we need to be their advisors, their counselors as well, to an objective that overcomes the role. Therefore, in this orientation, Mr. Megalou, the CEO of Piraeus Bank, has announced the previous month specific interventions and implement actions aiming at the climate change, bearing in mind what has been the outcome of the disastrous big fires in August. Some of those measures are the following: the financing by own bank funds, the study in order to see what are the negative impacts on agriculture and husbandry, aiming at the appropriate management of water resources in the territory of Greece. So we have a new specialized project by a 30% reduced interest rate from now until June 2022 in order to set up or renew modern irrigation systems. The further enhancement of the intelligent farming techniques by providing 6 free of charge subscriptions to farmers via GSMs. Also, in order to raise the awareness among farmers vis-à-vis the climate change, we also develop specific information material. In order to rehabilitate the agricultural food sector exploitations, we have also funding available as regards farmers with reduced interest rate by 30% in order to support farmers as regards food, agricultural production, husbandry, beekeeping, and so forth. According to specialists, the costs for the transition as regards our economy are fewer than what is going to be the outcome following investments in green investment. But the slower the pace towards transition, the higher the costs. In order to invest in those areas, the green and digital growth is actually a sine qua non, and there is no more time to lose. I wish the best of success to the works of this conference, and we would like to thank once again New Generation New Agriculture for their invitation, as well as all the members of this organization. Thank you, Mr. Alexandrou. We would also like to thank the Serafio Center of the Municipality of Athens for hosting this event. And now I would like to give the floor to the chair of the Scientific Committee, professor at the Agricultural University of Athens, Mr. George Papadakis.
Good afternoon. Hello, Mr. Alexandrou. Dear friends, I would like to welcome you to our conference on climate change and the future of the agri-food sector. Our conference aims at highlighting the relationship between climate change and agriculture to inform all interested parties and stakeholders regarding the necessary actions that need to be taken in order to reduce the effects of climate change on our farming and agriculture and the adaptation of farming to climate change, to highlight the opportunities that arise for farmers and our national economy by taking and implementing appropriate measures where necessary. The need for sustainable development, especially in the agriculture, calls for action now. Sustainable development is the type of development that meets the needs of the present, responds to the needs of the present, but does not affect the conditions for the future generation, especially when it comes to the ecosystems and agriculture. Sustainable development means how we can develop and implement the production systems that will remain productive and not be eliminated. The need for sustainability arises from various effects or other phenomena that we're well aware of, such as many of the implemented agricultural practices or farming practices that are no longer sustainable. Such non-sustainable practices affect the environment and biodiversity. They affect the well-being of animals and human health. And there are a lot of such examples of non-sustainable farming practices and food production practices. Such non-sustainable techniques and practices include the excessive use of chemicals in farming, as well as fertilizers, the cultivation of GMOs, the production of foods from large unicultures or monocultures, and also large quantities of food waste that is not utilized, and of course investment in many large farming operations, instead of investing in small farms and small farmers. We're still trying to clear forests for agricultural production. We breed animals without isolated from plants, instead of having them being bred with plants, in order to have integrated systems, wasting water as well as contamination and pollution in numerous manners. Therefore, our agriculture needs to change its methods and practices in order to become financially viable and sustainable, to be eco-friendly, socially acceptable, and protect public health care. We have to produce food for people and animals alike, as well as agricultural products using practices that are useful for public health and also promote profitability. Therefore, there is a need to implement, or rather to develop and implement, policies on socially sustainable agriculture. There's a need for environmental sustainability, in other words, implementation of methods and technologies using low input, reduced emissions, and moderation of climate change. There's a need for also financial sustainability. Therefore, financial aid to be given to the farmers in order to implement these changes. And of course, there's also dire need for horizontal measures such as farmer training. Now, the benefits from sustainable agriculture are multiple, such as the environmental protection, profitability for farmers and the national economy, efficient use of non-renewable resources, resource protection, protection of public health, and economic and social justice. Now, what are these methods and practices that we could implement today in order to achieve sustainable agriculture? Is the use of RES, renewable energy sources, technologies and practices of precision agriculture, precision farming rather, is the integrated plant protection, is the rotation, crop rotation, it's the organic farming and the regenerative farming, the protection of resources, especially soil and water, and the adoption of a variety of crops to protect biodiversity. Now, we've recently discovered that agriculture accounts for 1/4 of the man-made emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, it is very important to take measures in order to reduce such emissions of farming. Sustainable farming means reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, we need to implement new techniques, new methods to reduce the effects of climate change on our agriculture as well as reduce emissions from agriculture and farming. These are the things that we're going to discuss today and the forthcoming days in our conference, and I think that this is a major initiative taken by the New Generation New Agriculture Organization with the support, abundant support of the SNF, and we're going to give a lot of fertile discussions to our participants in order to have a sustainable farming, create sustainable farming that will reduce the effects on climate change for the benefit of agriculture itself. Now, the first session of our conference is on highlighting the climate change agenda in Greece, Europe, and the world. And our first keynote speaker is Professor Prodromos Zanis from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, who is also lead author at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Mr. Zanis, Professor Zanis, you have the floor.
Καλησπέρα σας.
Good evening.
Αξιότιμες κυρίες, αξιότιμοι κύριοι, αξιότιμοι.
Dear guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear organizers from New Agriculture, New Generation. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation to participate in this meeting. So the overall objective of my intervention is to make a brief overview as regards global knowledge vis-à-vis climate change in the Mediterranean era and the temperature rise. So, based on the 6th review report of the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change, to which I was honored to participate as a co-author. And of course, waiting for the important conclusions following the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. So, I will start by sharing with you some slides. So, the changes in temperature globally based on observations with specific technical equipment. So, those observations date back to the end of the 19th century up until today. So, you can see on the slide that there is an ongoing continuous increase of the temperature of the Earth, which has reached approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial era. Concurrently, you can also see the changes as regards CO2 concentrations. This is depicted in the red line on the slide, and this is again based on observations and measurements in Hawaii. So you see that there is a constant increase as regards the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So in 2010 we had 413 parts per million, which is a record high if you are to compare this to the pre-industrial era. So this is actually a 149% increase. So it is very telling to see what is the relation between the rise in the temperature and the rise in the CO2 emissions in the overall 15 or 16 years. So we have a 30% increase in the CO2 emissions, which is represented also at the level of 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature. And if we were to estimate what would happen if we had a double as high CO2 emissions increase, then you would have an increase in temperature at 3.3 degrees Celsius. So this is a specific index or parameter dubbed climate sensitivity, and this is what we use at the level of climate models. So this increase by 3.3% estimate is very close to the average estimate that we have, and we know based on the various models on climate. So overall, what has been published ever since 1973 at the level of climate change models are, let's say, quite solid in future increase in temperature and temperature rise. So some tables and graphs based on the recent UN climate, on the recent, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What we observe is that the recent changes at the level of climate are rather broad, fast and intense. And we would also say that they are unprecedented for the last 3,000 or 2,000 years, and this can also be depicted if you can see the graph on the left. Also, the last 100 years, it is considered to be the hottest one in the course of the last 150,000 years or 100,000 years. A very important message based on the 6th review report is that practically it is beyond doubt that human activities are to blame almost exclusively for this temperature rise on our planet by 1.1 degree Celsius. It is also interesting to see what is the situation in the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean basin is an ecological system which hosts approximately 10% of the flora and 7% of the various marine species internationally, and 22 are its neighboring countries with a high density population rate. And it is interesting to note that the Mediterranean is of the most sensitive and vulnerable areas on our planet due to the anthropogenic climate change. So it is observed that the average annual temperatures around the Mediterranean basin are approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than in the period between 1880 and 1889. So average increase values which go higher than the trends that are currently observed on our planet, which is at the level of 1.1 degrees Celsius. So the climate change affects every corner and every area on the Earth in various ways, either by having higher incidence of extreme climate phenomena, such as heat waves, for example, or intense rainfalls or drought events, which become all the more frequent and all the more intense. So this is also valid for the Mediterranean, and at the level of high confidence intervals, indeed, the frequency and the intensity of the heat wave incidents have increased, and at the level of average confidence intervals, also we observe that drought events, agricultural drought events, are also on the rise, whereas we cannot be certain, equally certain, as regards intense rainfall or precipitation. So, about the future, for each ton of CO2 that is emitted, the temperature rise on the planet becomes almost linear. So this is actually what the graph is showing. So this linear relation vis-à-vis the rise in the temperature and the additional CO2 emissions or increased CO2 emissions. So the average estimate as regards the residual CO2 emission in order to maintain, let's say, the average increase of temperature by 1.1% is at the level of 500 megatons of CO2 emissions, which means that we do not have much, let's say, leeway left in order to adapt. And we would say that in the long run, and given the estimates are based on the current, let's say, commitments that we have, and even if we were to reduce considerably the CO2, the average increase in temperature by 1.1 degrees Celsius is going to be exceeded in the next coming 20 years, and the most high, let's say, probability is that for this to happen by mid-2030. So by 2030, and the trends, rather, on average, based on our estimations, which are to be forecasted by mid-2030, are not in line with what we expect for the average temperature rise by 1.1% on our planet. And when it comes to the future models, by every increase on our average temperature on our planet, the changes which are about to take place on the microclimate per region are expected to be even harsher and even more considerable. So this is even more true for the Mediterranean region, and we see that the levels of temperature and the levels of warming when it comes to the rise in temperature are higher. So if we have 1.5 degrees Celsius at the level of the global warming, in the Mediterranean, the estimates is at 2 degrees Celsius, and this is going to be even higher when we have higher global warming levels. So the extra, let's say, warming at the level of the Mediterranean is going to range between 0.5 and 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to the various average levels of global warming elsewhere. So this is also true when it comes to precipitation levels in the Mediterranean, and the reduction of precipitation is very characteristic, and it becomes even more intense when we have even higher global warming events on our planet. And the same is also valid when it comes to the levels of humidity of soil, which becomes decreased when we have higher levels of global warming. What you see here is the actual, let's say, events, observations when it comes to the summer temperatures and warming levels for the Mediterranean. So the higher that is, the higher the divergence between the rise in the temperature in the Mediterranean and the rest of the world. And, of course, this will become very apparent in the future as regards the extreme weather phenomena as well as the average levels of precipitation. And specifically for the Mediterranean, that would be traceable at the levels of heat wave events, as well as droughts and other problems at the agricultural production. So for every half degree of temperature rise, the number of extreme events will become higher, of course. And essentially, it is very interesting to see that in this very high complex situation involving the Mediterranean region due to climate change, which is characterized by warming, by less precipitation, by a change, an alternation of extreme events compared to droughts, and also changes at the level of the rise of the sea and acidification of the oceans. What is expected is to have both direct and indirect impacts in the coming decades in the agri-food sector. This will affect both the ecosystems, the deforestation, the agricultural resources, the desertification of fires, and the overall degradation of soil. On the slide, so based on the global warming scenario by 2 degrees Celsius globally, the availability of sweet water in the Mediterranean basin is likely to be reduced by 2 up to 15%, and this is among the highest levels of decrease globally. This is expected to happen by 2050 already. Furthermore, this combined impact due to the decreased levels of precipitation, global warming, and drought events are expected to lead to a desertification of various ecosystems around the Mediterranean, as well as other negative impacts. And this is something that you see around the Mediterranean. The orange color reflects the, let's say, more intense trends for such a phenomena. And this is not just the only impact. Of course, we talked about the increase of the average sea level, which is expected to take place in the Mediterranean based on various scenarios by 0.1 meters to 0.7 meters by the end of this century. And this certainly will have an impact on the various infrastructures and towns and cities around the shore, as well as the various aqua systems and habitats around the Mediterranean due to this increase of the sea level. And it is estimated that approximately 15 ports and cities with ports with a population exceeding 1 million people run a high risk to be flooded due to this increase of the sea level, unless other measures are taken in the imminent future. In conclusion, I would like to note that thanks to the increased knowledge based on physical sciences and thanks to the high-quality observations and calculations and a better understanding of how the climate system operates, we are in a better position to explain the anthropogenic activities' impact and project into the future in a more solid manner. We have reiterated on a number of occasions that we do not have much time left if we want to keep the temperature rise below the 2 degrees Celsius, and this is still valid. But unfortunately, after the publication of the next IPCC report, we may be in the position to say, unfortunately, too late. Therefore, it is much more timely than ever to take an interest in the present and in the future and see what are the commitments to be taken by mid-2050 and by showcasing the challenges and the threats at the level of climate change, which is also the key topic of this thematic part of our conference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Πώς είστε? Καλά. Στο άγχος, στην πίεση.
Good afternoon. Picking up from where Professor Zanis left off and saying that there is no planet B, let me recall the phrase of President Macron, there is no plan B, there is no planet B. We need to move fast and respond to this huge challenge. We're going to talk on the facets and aspects of climate change, which is a dramatically timely topic, and even actually more so today for three key reasons. First of all, because this UN COP on climate change, COP26 is in progress in Glasgow. The second, it was only last Thursday that the Ministry of the Environment introduced the climate law to the government cabinet, the first ever, and only the other day, 48 years ago, the Ministry of Agricultural Development presented its proposal on ecological schemes, and let me say, so 2023 based the new common agricultural policy of the EU in order for any farmer to get the entire subsidies and immediate aids will have to implement some environmentally friendly practices. These account for 25% of the subsidies, and this for Greece amounts to 460 million euro annually. So we have with us an excellent panel, which is in the heart of the actual affairs, of the current affairs. And I will first of all give the floor to the Secretary General of National Environment and Water of the Ministry of Environment and Energy, Professor Konstantinos Aravosis. We'll ask his view about the COP26 in Glasgow and the first feeling that he got and the timeline of the ministry regarding the climate law, and how difficult or easy he believes it is to implement this law, because it's unprecedented for Greece. In Greece, we have no problem with laws, we have got a problem with implementing them. So, Mr. Aravosis, you have the floor. As you said, quite rightly said, this is a special juncture that we live in. In Glasgow, currently the UN summit, all stakeholders, all participants from all countries are discussing whether we, as a globe, are going to agree on specific measures and targets, all of us together unanimously, in order to address the huge problem caused by the climate change. And it's in our country. We've seen the temperature rise. We see that there are phenomena of intense flooding phenomena, wildfires, etc. In the Glasgow summit, it seems, well, actually, I don't want to be pessimistic, but it seems that it's going to be of limited success, according to the initial indications, because, first of all, the presidents and representatives of two major countries that are in the top five polluters, that is China and Russia, and these two countries have not agreed on the common goals that are currently discussed in this summit conference, COP26. Secondly, in order for one to achieve an agreement, it does not suffice to have the European Union moving in this direction, European Union which is indeed quite ambitious to reduce its emissions by 55% by 2030. And similarly, with the change in government, the change in administration, the US has also adopted a highly ambitious target. But this is not enough, because for this summit conference to be successful, we need the participation and agreement of developing or underdeveloped countries. But to do this, We need to finance these countries. These countries need to be financed because, as we all realize, this is also a financial issue, economic issue. It takes a lot of hundreds of millions of funds to be injected into the developing and in underdeveloped countries from the developed world, such as the EU, the US, etc. And I don't see that at least at this summit such an agreement will be reached, so I'm not as optimistic. On the other hand, we as a country, when this administration took office, this government took office, the Prime Minister announced that we are going to move to full delignitisation by 2028. This is the target. All lignite-fired plants will shut down. We will be freed from lignite and other fossil fuels. And in fact, by 2028, almost all will have shut down already. And the other week, recently, as you mentioned, the new national climate law was introduced to the cabinet, and it's going to be open for consultation shortly. This climate law, first of all, we're amongst the first countries that proceed to the adoption of a national climate law. Now, what is a national climate law? It is a framework which includes all the measures and policies that will help us achieve highly ambitious targets for a country as well. And actually, our country was a forerunner in the EU agreement on 55% decrease of emissions by 2030 versus 2090, and then versus 1990. On the other hand, climate neutrality by 2050. These are the key targets. Now, we need to see how these targets are going to be achieved. And indeed, the national climate law defines that the climate is going to be the National Action Plan for Energy will take into account the climate, and the target is revised from 40% until last year is increased to 55%, a highly ambitious target that will force us to change our policies and take even more ambitious measures. So this is one aspect, one part, that is the reduction of pollutants, which is part of the environmental law. And the other part is that given that the climate change, no matter what we do, no matter what measures we take, even if there is an immediate global agreement, the effects of the reduced emissions will take long to be felt. In the forthcoming years, we will experience even more intense climate and weather phenomena. We're going to witness mega fires, floods, and actually much more frequently than in the past. Therefore, we need to adapt to these climate change effects. And this is why we need the measures for the adaptation to climate change. And there's a national plan for climate change adaptation. We need to implement this and pursue it. And this is further specialized into regional plans. So in other words, every region draws up its own plan that includes policies, measures, and specific investments in order to adapt to climate change, such as the sea level rise, desertification, and as we're talking about the agri-food and animal husbandry sector, the farming sector in general, these effects have got a major impact. Therefore, at a national level, we also introduce another level, the municipal municipal level, which means that every municipality will have to draw up such a study that will include specific policies and investments. Now, on top of everything, in order to achieve these, there's yet another milestone that is suggested, and actually all this is going to be placed into public consultation. Therefore, we will be able to receive feedback and more proposals, possibly, and that will be the target of the zero footprint by 2050. And in 2040, there's going to be an intermediate target of 80%. Of 40%, excuse me. So we will 80% target, of footprint. And also there's going to be a national observatory that will monitor the adaptation to climate change. And all these will be subject to public consultation and a special forum, online forum, with the participation of NGOs, as well as businesses, business representatives, and the entire society in order to monitor target achievement on an annual basis and actually by sector. And this is very important. We will have carbon budgets per sector, and they will be set annually and they will be reviewed annually. And one of the sectors that will be key sectors that will be monitored, of course, is the farming sector. So there is going to be a budget and a review report on this a budgetary target, and the target achievement will be reviewed. This is a key element for the forthcoming years, and also the national climate change also includes some individual measures, such as measures on the enhancement of electromobility. And what is suggested, in fact, is for taxis after 2025, all new taxis, to be electric vehicles, and the entire fleet after 2030 to be electrified. Actually, all new cars that enter the fleet to be electric vehicles. Now, the measure in 2023, a new measure will be launched. Wherever there is a natural gas network, then all boilers will, of course, will have to be gas powered. And after 2030, all boilers will be fueled by natural gas. Water boilers, that is. Now, thanks to this environmental law that we believe that is quite ambitious and also has impacts the operation of the economy, we sincerely believe that a lot of things are going to change in our country, a lot of policies are going to change in our country, and this goes hand in hand with the following. And actually, it is related with the farming sector once again. The roadmap for circular economy was also introduced the other day, and this roadmap includes 72 specific targets, measures, and actually this is what I can only share for now briefly, is that it has to do with how we are going to transform the Greek economy based on circular economy models, and this has to do with resource management, optimum resource management on the one hand, and on the other hand, optimization of waste management, minimization of waste, and in essence, the ultimate purpose or goal is to get to a zero waste society. So to have zero waste, and this is something that also concerns the farming sector, because there's a lot to be done there as well, and that will eventually help in achieving the climate targets. Thank you very much, Professor. I believe that now you can pass the floor to the other Secretary General, the Secretary General, Mr. Bayonetas, who is going to talk to us about the targets that are going to be binding, of course, at the national level and European level, as this is expressed through the new Green Deal and the strategies on biodiversity and the farm to fork that was recently passed by the European Parliament. Of course, the farming sector is the one that is mostly affected by the climate change. We see this almost daily. On the other hand, it is in a sector where, in order for our products, the Greek or European products, to implement the standards, there's going to be an increased cost, and they will need to compete with other countries that do not implement such standards. Because, as Mr. Livanos said, we need actions to be taken at global level. So, the question is whether you believe that the farming sector, the agriculture sector in Greece can respond to these challenges, or is it indeed, or are these targets overambitious, perhaps, and beyond our capability? And tell us where we are when it comes to the national strategy, since you introduced the 19 environmental schemes in Mytilene. Will there be 19 or less? And what is the timeline? Will the country be able to have submitted a strategic plan by the end of the year?
Thank you very much, Mr. Makris. As was very well mentioned by the previous speaker, my colleague, we are all witnesses of the various impacts due to climate change or crisis. And of course, one of the sectors which is very much affected by that is the agricultural sector. This involves both the manufacturing as well as production. As you were well mentioned, alongside with Mr. Aravosis, the European Union, the member states, we are all faced with those impacts. Therefore, we have drafted a plan at the national level as well as at the European level, which is a very ambitious one. This becomes even more mandatory due to the fact that we see the time conjuncture as well as the intensity of the various phenomena and events. So in due time, and this is also our estimate and our impression, that this is going to become even more intense and even more frequent, especially in the agricultural sector in the next coming years, 5 years or so. So indeed, we need to have a very ambitious objective target set, starting as of today, if not mentioned yesterday. Now, in the frame of the new common agricultural policy, as well as the European, let's say, Green Deal, which is the political umbrella of the European Union, the agricultural sector is called upon to play its own role in this common European effort to achieve those ambitious targets by 2030. So, indeed, this is a turning point for us because it's an agreement that was actually achieved after a long time and strong negotiations, so there were arguments from both sides as regards how ambitious would be the level to be set and how ambitious would be the effort by the European farmers, and of course taking into account the impacts of those intense disastrous phenomena. So there is this set of arguments at the level of the European Union Ministers of Farming. So you have the challenge. However, on the other side, you also have this uncertainty as to whether the farmers in Europe will be able to commit themselves to such levels. So the European farmers are very much interested in protecting their environment because they depend on that a lot. So resources such as the soil and the water resources. So although there has been not rational use of those two types of resources in the past, this has been rationalized, of course, furthermore, but now this has to be further implemented. The strategy of biodiversity as well as the strategy from farm to fork are two specific objectives. For example, other objectives to reduce fertilizers by 50%, also reduce by 50% antibiotics in husbandry, by 50% reduction in pesticides, and also 25% of the cultivated lands in the European Union by 2030 should involve organic farming, and also increase non-productive elements of the agricultural landscape, that is, have space and soil free from farming in order for other species at the level of biodiversity to develop are also some of the recommendations. So now we are at the point where we are discussing to what extent those quantitative targets will also become mandatory in the regulation which is about to be adopted by the Parliament. And this, of course, will affect the strategic national plans of each member state. So the goals, the objectives are ambitious, so all sectors and stakeholders should contribute to those objectives. But of course, this will require a large funding envelope. As we speak, another topic in the debate and continues to be important at the level of the councils of ministers is that the farmers are called upon to do two things. First, quality, safe food production for all consumers, and at the same time move on to green actions. So the eco schemes are mandatory for member states, but voluntary for European farmers. Actually, this will transform the everyday life of the European farmer. So the European farmer must actually commit to applying and putting into implementation one ecological action, and not only at the level of compliance, but at the level of efficiency, that is, qualitative targets that have to be met as a target on an annual basis. So there is a specific change on the farmers. So you need to convince them that they ought to contribute to that. They need to be part of this on a voluntary basis, and they need to implement such ecological actions and be measured at the level of their efficiency based on quantitative targets. So this has to take place on a daily basis, on an annual basis, and based on indicators. This is a big challenge that is debated upon at the level of the councils of ministers. So all member states are trying to set up a list of various ecological schemes based on an indicative list provided by the European Union in order to be understood by national member states farmers, easily to be understood and implemented. So we have proceeded with putting forward a list of such eco schemes as was presented last Sunday by our minister on the island of Mytilene. So this is a list which is broad enough in order to encompass all types of production and agriculture. So you know that you have Pillar 1 state aids, and this is going to be further forward the next programming periods. We have the three specific agronomic regions, and based on that we tried to provide as many options and choices as possible in order for no farmer or no breeder to be left outside, to be excluded. So every year they have to opt one of the options under this list. So as an indication, crop rotation. As an indication, cereals to be cultivated during the winter, or legumes to be also cultivated, and this will support in the amplification of the soil. Ecological focus, which means that you give the possibility for biodiversity to further develop in order for flora and fauna to flourish. Also, proper management of husbandry lands, also the preservation of pastures, the preservation of terraces of soil on the islands. Something else in collaboration with the Ministry of the Environment is the management of fighting zones and buffer zones. The question is to what extent to the existing zones that you already have to provide these areas for as pasture land for sheep, for example, or cattle. And this also in line with commitments in order to preserve those areas on an annual basis. Now, in collaboration with Mr. Mousseroulis on the level of the committee for the scheme for winning off from lignite in the area in the region of Macedonia, we examine how we can actually replenish those areas or handle over those areas after this transition phase for farming and cultivation. So some of those schemes are mandatory for the member state to provide them as options. So under Pillar 1, 25% of those actions need to become mandatory. So this is a quite high objective. So on an annual basis, Pillar 1 represents 1.9 billion euros, and out of which 25% is approximately 400 million. So we are obliged to commit this amount to specific actions, and then, of course, you need to convince the farmers to render it understood and be accepted by the farmers. So this is also a challenge for us on a national level. This is why we are looking forward to their input and proposals. At the level of the National Action Plan, according to our milestones, by the end of this year we will be able to submit it to the European Commission. Not all member states are already on this, because the previous week we participated in a teleconference with the DG director as well as other colleagues, secretary generals from other member states, and I'm afraid that the timeline is rather tight. I'm not sure whether this is going to be further adapted with flexibility. Anyway, according to our timeline, we are progressing, and by the end of this month we will have a first draft for this strategic plan, and the minister will be in a position to present it before the Parliament, the Greek Parliament. There are still 2 or 3 elements or questions that are still pending, decisions to be made by the minister, and also pending issues as regards pillar number 2, and also the interlinked state aids. So we are at this stage. As we have said, by the end of the month we want to have it under public consultation in order to receive feedback, proposal, comments, and by the end of the year to submit it to the Parliament. Thank you. And now we can give the floor to the expert per se in order to have the overall state of play at the level of the European Union. So we will connect with Brussels, and we will give the floor to Mr. Chaniotis, Tassos Chaniotis, who is the Director of Strategy at the level of the Director General for Agriculture, European Commission. He is indeed at the heart of developments. Mr. Chaniotis, what is the state of play? What is the progress made as regards the Green Deal in the agricultural sector? What is your feeling? You are aware of the criticism and the arguments. A couple of weeks ago, we listened to you. You participated in a conference. So what is criticism? The criticism is that the targets are so ambitious, and therefore there is a risk that instead of having produced more with less and protecting the environment, we run the risk to have produce less with less. And actually, there will be a transition of the production activity in countries outside the European Union. So what is actually the trend at the level of the European Union? And taking this opportunity, Greece is on the good track. We are progressing. We are among the leaders in this preparation, as Mr. Bayonetta said.
First of all, let me ask you. First of all, I'd like to start with the latter. We don't know about Greece. We'll see when the strategic plans are submitted. We'll see where it is. Greece was the country that was the last country to submit its plan 7 years ago. Now it has advanced, of course. And from this point of view, I believe the strategic plan that will be submitted by Greece will tackle the challenges to a large extent. It is obvious that in all these final plans, there will be further discussion between the Member States and the Commission to see where they should be amended or enhanced. Let me clarify a few things that need to be cleared out. I've been in the European Commission for several years and I've experienced several reforms, and always in the beginning there is always the feeling that things are moving faster than before. It is true that versus previous reforms, this is much more complex because the targets, the common agricultural policy do not only affect primary production, but cover the entire spectrum all the way to consumers, and to a large extent the success of this of the policy of the farm to fork policy will be determined by changes in consumers. Because as was said, unless consumer habits change, this target will not be easy to achieve. But we have to clarify some other aspects as well. The overall direction towards the positive footprint of farming is something that dates back to the previous CAP. What we achieved the Green Deal is to add some targets at European level. At European level, let me stress this, and in order to see whether we're going to approach this or not, we have to look at the individual, at the national targets and the individual national strategic plans. And these targets have to be set anyway. There's a discussion going on that shouldn't be going on, in fact, and we were wasting our time. A typical example, the first workshop that we had in preparation of the CAP reform in 2018, actually 2017, was on the use of antibiotics in for animal food. That was in 2017, and another 3 workshops regarding agri-food programs. Now, there are these affected programs that were only in place. What we're currently doing is that we enhance the range as well as the flexibility of the range of policies and the flexibility of member states to implement them. And of course, the ambition level also rises for farmers, but we are in the 21st century. We can't discuss whether we should have crop rotation or not. I think we've reached a point where we've forgotten that developments have run faster than the adaptation of policies. So we need to be oriented to practical issues. I heard earlier Professor Zanis, and he watched his presentation, and when we see the challenges that we're faced with, there's no point in discussing what will happen if the temperature rises by 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, not because it's not important, but because we experience it on a daily basis. So what should we do immediately? First of all, the national strategic plans need to include best practices that do exist, that are implemented by farmers, but are not generally implemented. So this places emphasis on the generation of new knowledge that will enable us to deal with new diseases caused by the climate change and other challenges, and also will give us the opportunity to discuss how we are going to implement existing knowledge that does work, that we know it works. And it is the existence or none of advisory systems for farmers is key. It's about dissemination of knowledge. And another key issue is the discussion on the increased cost of environmental measures. Well, obviously, there's going to be an increased cost entailed to the environmental measures, but agriculture is not a sector that is left unaffected by technological developments, because if something decreases farming costs is new technology. So the way you can implement then measures improving your environmental measures that increase your production costs, but at the same time use technology that reduce your production costs. And knowledge implementation infrastructure are the most important aspects. And there's a set of practices that pertain to milder forms of farming. For instance, in organic farming, the use of new qualified technologies is quite impressive. So the major dilemma and challenge is how we're going to manage, and of course not overnight, to reduce the production cost in order not to be rolled out to the farmer's budget or the consumer. Second, when we talk about what other countries do, we have to talk about food safety standards and production methods. Whatever is imported into the EU has to meet the same the food safety standards that are met by the food produced in the European Union. Of course, we can't check the effects of agriculture, of farming in other countries, but we can see the residues. We can identify the residues. Now, how can we make sure that if we establish alliances that rely on a reality that is experienced by everyone, then China and Russia may not take part in Glasgow, but the effects of the climate change, they are felt by them as well, and therefore gradually there's been a trend for everyone to turn to a direction towards the same goals. And the last point about financing of the common agricultural policy. Approximately 60 million euro is allocated to the common agricultural policy every year, and for better or worse, no more funds can be found. Therefore, these funds have to be allocated in a targeted manner, specifically to those that can prove that are willing and capable to move in the right direction, which is in one way. If you talk to farmers, nobody will tell you that I don't want to do this or give me more money to do these things. Most of them say, tell us how we should take this turn, how we should change direction. And I believe that this is where the delay is caused. Therefore, we need to practically explain and understandably explain that what we ask of farmers to do are things done or are things already performed by other farmers. And this is where we should place emphasis. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chaniotis. And now, very fast, because we're running late, we give the floor to Mrs. Fivi Kuduri, that actually took part in one of the panels of COP26. So she's a professor at the Athens University of Economics and Business, and we would like her feeling of the COP26 and whether she's more or less optimistic after what she's seen. And picking up from what Mr. Chaniotis left off, if we all say that every reasonable person agrees on contributing to climate change, nobody can oversee that there is some cost entailed to it. How can this cost be offsets, excuse me, so that we can adjust in the best possible manner and as fast as possible?
Well, yes, good evening. Can you hear me? I think yes. Little by little we can hear you even better. Okay, so we can hear you. Fine, so we can proceed. So there are some slides that I am sharing right now with you. Okay, so the screen share actually is not something that is accessible to the interpreters. So, having said this, I indeed participated in this current COP, and I can say that this has been one of the best COP meetings in my life. Also, last year I participated, and I was the European Association of Environmental Economists Association. This is the largest scientific association for the economists for the environment, members from 85 members, and I am the president-elect. Indeed, this there was an event organized by this association, and another event was organized as the UNNT, which is the UN Network for Sustainability Solutions, chairing the European Hub Med universities. Both sessions, as well as other sessions which I attended, what I can share with you is the following. The financial sector, for the first time, appears to be very positive as to the funding of various actions which will lead to climate neutrality. The businesses are even more eager to fund such actions. So the largest enterprises in the world and the ones that are vanguard businesses, that are state-of-the-art businesses at the level of IT technologies, are very much willing to be involved in what we call climate neutrality, adaptation to climate change, as well as protection of biodiversity and supporting or avoiding the collapse of ecosystems. Of course, the academic community and the NGOs have always been advocates of such actions. So there is a very strong interest, which is inspired by the fact that the transition to sustainability, as we speak, is profitable and very promising for any stakeholder having the technology to become a participant in such actions. And this comes along with the awareness on behalf of the countries that there can be no other way than the renewable energy sources, nature-based solution, climate adaptation, and circular economy. So the countries have become aware of that as the only option, and the only question is around when. When are the countries going to commit to climate neutrality. Of course, the objective is by 2050. And the best pathway is what is shown by the European Commission, that is by 55% reduction by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2030, and the interim target by 2040. China, India disappoint us. Why? Because they say that by 2060 and by 2050, says China and India, will become neutral. However, 1 year ago, none of the two countries would state an opinion. So you realize how important it is to have such intentions. And my feeling is that the political world will follow suit the financial markets developments. And indeed, we are lucky because despite this misfortune of climate change, which is directly related to the capacity of the human nature to commit to measures in order to avoid this climate crisis and change. So now that we are witnessing those extreme weather conditions at a high frequency rate, despite all that, therefore, we are fortunate enough because of the leapfrogging progress in technology. So we have solutions that are more affordable than fossil fuel solutions. So now the challenge, the wager, if you like, is to see whether we can transform the infrastructures at the level of our economy and our society in order to be able to utilize those new technological solutions, which are affordable ones, competitive ones, vis-à-vis fossil fuels. Now, the key conclusions from COP26 as of today, because unfortunately I had to return to Greece, so we have unfortunately 130 trillion from 450 finance industries and businesses, which amounts and businesses put at the center of their operations the climate and sustainable financing. The global standards 40 is set up, which actually is a follow-up after greenwashing, and therefore any investment, any solution ought to be indeed a green and digital solution and not just an apparent green solution. Also, national delegations are involved and have expressed an interest in order to have reduction in the methane emissions, which is a very important, very considerable, rather, parameter vis-à-vis climate crisis and global warming. There are approximately 100 countries, including Russia and Brazil, which are co-signatory countries as regards the reduction of or rather a solution for forest conservation and the reduction in the trend of the negative trend of deforestation. Also, there is another flagship effort which amounts to approximately 4 billion, and the United Arab Emirates are also participating in that in order to have the agricultural sector contribute to the climate change management. And
Έχουμε μια μεγάλη συζήτηση για το πώς μπορεί να βοηθήσει.
There is a big debate in order to see how we can support the global south and be part and parcel of this sustainability transition, because the transition is not only about the developed countries. This transition ought to have the developing countries as a part and parcel of it. So, indeed, with the increase of the population in the global south, at least from a geopolitical point of view, there will be instability, with all the other sequelae which follow suit due to a sluggish growth in the global south. And it is important to finance these technological solutions in order to have business opportunities based on technological solutions in the global south, to create jobs and favor the presence of positive multipliers in order for these important areas involving natural resources and large numbers of the population to be part or to partake in this transition. And, of course, it is very important for China and India to be back on board as regards this debate about fossil fuels and CO2 emissions in order for the objectives to be met more quickly. I believe that all those developments are very important. I believe that this transition actually will have as protagonists businesses, enterprises, and undertakings, both from the private and the public sector in the form of PPPs, and the role of sustainable financing, both from the multilateral institutions as well as from the European institutions, such as the ECB or the national banks, are very important. Therefore, in this, Professor Koundouri, I'm afraid that we're lagging behind. You need to conclude in one sentence, please. Yes, one sentence, your conclusion. So, with the 17 targets for sustainable development, with the ratification of the Paris agreement, which will take place today in COP, with the European Green Deal, with the financing at the level of the European Green Deal of 1 trillion euros, as well as supported by the Next Generation EU and its funds, which are 750 billion, as well as the EU taxonomy, the national legislations on the environment, and the 3 legislative measures for Fit for 55. Thanks to all that, I believe that Europe paves the way in order for all those agreements and pacts to be fully rolled out. And it paves the way in order for all stakeholders to draft and design very detailed investment paths implementing the regulations. So this is to be copied by the developed and developing world. Efforts are in place in many countries, in the Americas as well. And then the Global South needs to properly copy that, and to that to be linked with financing as well. This is what we discussed at the level of G20 in Italy, as well as in the Food Summit a while ago. So you need to have more funding from the developed world to be allocated into the global south for green investments in order for all the countries on our planet to be part of this transition towards sustainability. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Koundouri, for giving us this overview on the COP26. So last but not the least is our guest speaker, Nikos Manzaris from the Green Tank. As you know, Mr. Manzaris, the last athlete in the torch relay is called upon to speed up in order to win the race. So we have very tight time frames. And of course, you will be asked upon to conclude on this panel. So my question is, what are your views, what are your thoughts as regards Greece's climate performance, and of course at the level of commitments? Would you say that the objectives to be met are feasible? And what are the parameters that will weigh on whether those commitments are to be met? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Makris. Usain Bolt. I'm going to be a fast sprinter like Usain Bolt. Glasgow. Things are not black or white. They're rather grey scale. In the grey scale, a lot has been said about Glasgow. I'll focus on 3 key points. Mostly it was a white shade. First of all, I focus on the 30% decrease of methane emissions by 2030 versus the 2020 level. This is a major target that will affect the farming and agricultural sector at large, because we've got a lot of methane emissions there, and it will also affect the extraction and use of natural gas. Second, the agreement on forest protection by 2030. We've got 120 countries participating versus 40 several years ago when the agreement failed. Very important for biodiversity and very important for the tackling of climate crisis, because as we know, the forests can alleviate and dampen the effects of everything we do. And then we have got the COP commitments for the measures that will be taken by the individual countries. According to a recent study, the UN recent study, we haven't been doing very well. Our commitments will lead to a 2.5 degrees temperature rise versus 1.5. And there are countries that assumed climate neutrality commitments by 2050 and then 2070. And these commitments are very important. And during COP, the International Energy Agency presented an analysis showing that these commitments lead us to a limiting of the temperature rise to 1.8 degrees Celsius, and we need to further study this and understand the mechanism. Now, regarding Greece, when it comes to our climate performance until 2007, we were quite responsible in terms of climate, because we increased our net emissions. We had several tons. In 2007, we reached 137 million tons of CO2 equivalent. After then, however, we started reducing the green gas emissions, and this has been stepped up in recent years, especially after 2017, because there was a radical reduction in lignite production, because the lignite was responsible for most of our emissions here in Greece, and the reduction in the lignite-fired power generation helped us improve our performance. Now, currently, we're below the European average. The European average is 9% higher than ours. Therefore, we've got difficult way ahead of us, and this is why it's difficult to honor this commitment of a 75% decrease by 2050. But the climate law is very important, and we need to have energy coal budgets because there are different challenges in the different economy sectors. There's one thing, the industry is different from farming, from fishing, and from processing, manufacturing. Therefore, this climate, we hope that this climate law is not going to be wishful thinking, but it will be supported by specific measures and financing to be implemented. Now, what are the prerequisites for success? First of all, we need the involvement of all the economy sectors. And so far, when we thought of climate change, we only thought of the Ministry of Energy and power generation. No, this is not how it goes. This doesn't add up. In order to achieve the 2050 target, we need full delignitization as well as use of alternative fuels. Then there has to be consent among the political parties. Climate crisis issue cannot be a field of opposition because otherwise it will fail. And also the message to the society is not the correct one. And we need everybody's involvement in the tackling of the climate change. Therefore, awareness-raising campaigns for the people are of paramount importance. And third, we need financing. Of course, needs will be required for the transition. It's not going to be easy for the transformation. But let me stress that the tackling of the climate crisis can also be an opportunity. Let me give you an example. We've got a energy crisis. We'll know that. Rise in electricity prices, etc. Imagine the citizens that set up an energy community and consume the energy they generate in a solar farm. Would they worry about this price hike? Of course not. And on the other hand, would the ministry and the government need to take measures in order to protect vulnerable households? Of course not. So the measures that tackle the energy crisis and the climate crisis can have multiple benefits. Thank you very much. Honestly, thank you very much. I can't believe how concisely you presented your views. I hope that our country will move as concisely and fast and to the point to implement these measures. Without further ado, I would like to thank Ms. Koudouri, Mr. Chaniotis in Brussels, Mr. Aravosi, Mr. Bayonet, and Mr. Mazari for their very interesting presentations, speeches. And now we pass flow to the next session on the threats and opportunities of climate change, especially in the agri-food sector. Thank you very much. And I thank the organizers as well for inviting us to this impeccably organized conference. Thank you and good evening.
Αγαπητοί φίλοι, γεια σας και πάλι. Ήρθε η ώρα για την δεύτερη θεματική μας σήμερα με θέμα κλιματική αλλαγή, επιπτώσεις, απειλές και ευκαιρίες στην αγροδιατροφή. Ο ομιλητής μας, ο κεντρικός ομιλητής στη θεματική αυτή είναι ο κύριος Μόρισον, Director and Strategic Program Leader, Food and Agriculture Organization, γνωστό μας FAO, Food Systems Program από τον FAO. Κύριε Μόρισον,
Mr. Morrison,
the floor is yours.
Yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Am I set to present? I don't hear anything.
Έχουμε κάποια τεχνικά προβλήματα.
Seems we're running.
Hello?
We have some technical issues.
Well, good evening and many thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to provide some thoughts on the relationship between climate change and agri-food systems. Let me set this presentation in the context of the recently concluded UN Food Systems Summit, as I think this can help us in understanding how the bidirectional relationship between climate change and agri-food systems is currently being conceptualized, and also the actions that are being formulated to reduce the negative impacts that have been identified. The summit, which took place on the 23rd of September after a 2-year preparatory process, generated a portfolio of action. This included, most importantly, a statement by the UN Secretary-General, which set out how food systems transformation can help to accelerate delivery across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and how this agenda can be taken forward through the work at all levels of governance. At the national level, by building on the processes of the national dialogues, which are initiated in almost 150 countries, and the national pathways that have been generated by over 100 of those countries, but also supported by coalitions of action, which bring together global organizations into closer interaction with governments. Importantly, in the context of this session, we can see coalitions of action emerging around action areas on nature-based solutions and on building resilience. And I'll refer back to these later in the presentation. Another feature of the summit was that it drew on multi-stakeholder commitments from across society, from business, from producers, from civil society, from indigenous peoples, and importantly from youth. And again, these ideas and actions are reflected very much in what we will be seeing as the post-summit approach, which again I'll comment upon a little later. Just to give a sense of the importance of climate change and agri-food systems in the summit process, this chart illustrates the number of times a particular issue was mentioned in a member state statement to the summit. And we can see that climate resiliency, mitigation, adaptation featured significantly in member state statements. And this demonstrated a real growing appreciation of the important relationship between climate change and agri-food systems at the highest level, which I think, to be honest, had been missing to a large extent before then. The relationship between climate change and agri-food systems works in both directions. A new report from FAO, which was released just a couple of days ago at COP26, estimates that up to 31% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the agri-food system. Land use change, including deforestation, is key, but emissions are also generated through the way in which crops are produced, in the form of methane from livestock. And as seen in this diagram, throughout the supply chain, in processing, in transportation, in storage, in retail, and in the disposal of food waste. This increased depreciation is important because in the past, most mitigation policies focused on the energy, transportation, and industrial sectors. And while these sectors were being addressed, emissions from agri-food systems continued to increase. And in fact, they grew by 16% in the last 3 decades alone. But climate change also affects agri-food systems. It holds back the contribution of agri-food systems to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, productivity losses impact on food availability. These impacts are seen both in the major crops, such as wheat, rice, and maize, but also significantly on global fisheries, with the potential halving of productivity levels if action is not taken. Climate change can also increase the prevalence of pests and diseases, and as we've seen increasingly over the last couple of years, the incidence of extreme weather events is increasing, and this is causing catastrophic losses along the supply chain, not just at the level of production, but in terms of how food products are generated and shifted along the chain towards the consumer. If we look in a bit more detail at one food system outcome, food safety, we can see that these impacts are often interrelated. So, for example, an increase in temperature can increase infections from foodborne pathogens. It can increase heavy metal uptake from soils, for example, arsenic in rice. And it can also increase toxins producing fungi and marine algae. So addressing climate impacts on food safety needs a joined up One Health approach. And this joined up approach really is needed throughout and when we're addressing all of the climate impacts on agri-food systems. There are, however, many opportunities to create food systems that not only reduce these bidirectional impacts between climate and food systems and vice versa, but also do so in a way that help food systems to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, restoring degraded land can remove carbon from the atmosphere, but at the same time increase the production of food. So, and we see the quantities that are involved. For example, if we restore all degraded land, we can remove up to 51 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere, and at the same time raise the level of food production by 17.6 megatons per year. These are significant amounts. And so there's a real win-win situation. In a similar way, having healthier soils can offset up to 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, it will also help to reduce biodiversity loss, which is causing systemic stresses throughout the agri-food system. Cutting methane emissions from livestock through improved feeding and genetics can at the same time improve animal health and the quality of the livestock product. And developing aquatic value chains, for example, seaweed production, can significantly help to decarbonize the global economy. So this chart provides just some examples of priority interventions. And the point I want to make here is it's not just about improving production practices. We also need a lot more attention to early warning systems, to risk transfer mechanisms, to climate-proofing supply chain infrastructure. And this is especially important as we advocate for greater consumption of perishable crops. We need better functioning cold chains. Cold chains take energy. So we need to do this in a climate-proofing way, to build infrastructure, to improve infrastructure, to ensure that we're delivering nutritious food, but not at the same time creating further impacts on climate. Reducing food loss and waste can also have significant positive impacts on the extent of global greenhouse emissions, as can changing dietary patterns. But of course, such actions will be ineffective if they are not coordinated. And I think one of the reasons, in fact, that the Food System Summit was called for in the first place was a recognition that although there were a lot of good ideas, a lot of willingness of food system actors to change their behavior and to change their practices, these actions were not well aligned. And this has really limited the effectiveness of efforts to transform food systems onto a more sustainable footing. So we need urgent action at two levels. Firstly, to identify complementary responses across different sectors so that we're working in an aligned way across agri-food, across transportation, across energy, across health. And we also need to consider the interlinkages between these different systems, how they're playing out against each other. But we also need efforts to strengthen the coherence within and across institutions, particularly at the national level. We've seen throughout the national dialogue process of the Food System Summit that limited coherence is holding governments back from meaningful change, which limits the impact of agri-food systems on climate change, and vice versa, limits the extent to which mitigation and adaptation measures can be put in place effectively. We've seen that this dialogue and the improved multi-stakeholder platforms that have arisen are key in improving this coordination and coherence. One example of work that we're doing at FAO at the moment illustrates this quite well. We do a lot of work on urban food systems. Urban food systems are important because 70% of the global food production is currently consumed by people who live in urban areas. So clearly the way in which urban food systems are functioning will have a major impact on food systems more broadly. We're working with municipalities to help them to develop their food systems, but at the same time working with national governments to ensure consistency and coherence between the policy framework at the national level and the needs of the municipality to meet the objectives of urban food systems. And I think this is replicated across many different examples in relation to food systems. So to end this short presentation, I just want to come back to the Food System Summit and where we go to next. The two key elements, I think, are the continued support to national governments in taking forward their context-specific transformation pathways, which articulate the priorities for a specific country. They take into account the context and the capacities of countries and map out a pathway to a more transformational and sustainable food system. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, we have a series of emerging initiatives which ideally will support national governments in addressing the priorities that they've identified in their pathways. And so this chart illustrates some of these emerging issues under each of the action areas which were articulated by the UN Secretary General. And I would draw your attention particularly to the nature-based solutions column, where we see a range of foci of these emerging initiatives which are seeking to progress the agenda, which are relevant for particular contexts. You can see, for example, we have emerging initiatives around agroecology, but at the same time, a set of initiatives around livestock, those which are looking to move towards more sustainable livestock, those which are looking to resize the livestock industry, and others which are looking more to help countries restore grasslands and savannas. In a similar way, under building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks and stress, which I think is also important to the context of this conference, there is attention on ensuring that pathways are climate resilience and on strengthening local supply chains, not as a replacement for international trade, but as a complement to international trade to ensure security and protection against shocks and stress. But again, the key challenge will be finding this appropriate balance in the priorities to be pursued by different countries to ensure that the pathways take into account their unique characteristics, their priorities, and their capacities. So I would end by saying there is no one size fits all, but we do at least have an increased recognition of the importance of climate in relation to agri-food systems, of the linkages, and also of some of the solutions that we can bring to bear in addressing those. So again, I would thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation to address this important conference. Thank you.
Καλησπέρα σας. Είμαι ο Δημήτρης ο Βολδάκης.
Good afternoon. My name is Dimitris Voldakis, and I'm the facilitator, the coordinator of the second panel here today. And I feel I am twofold honor in my capacity as capacity building manager and as agronomist. After 2.5 hours, the interest remains quite intrigued through the social media, and without further ado, we'll move on to our discussion. We saw the political framework of climate change illustrated in the previous panel, previous session, and now we're going to look into the interaction of political issues with the agri-food systems. And the latest report of IPCC in 2021 shows the accelerating climate change, according to scientists, as well as increase in the combination of extreme phenomena, and also it highlights methane as a key factor of the climate change. It actually affects climate change by 1/4. In this panel, I've got the honor to talk with, first of all, the ladies, of course, Ms. Andriana Cagliora, assistant professor of Foods and Human Nutrition at the Harokopou University of Athens. We also have the honor to have with us Mr. Christos Giannakakis, Chairman of the Hellenic Agriculture, President of the National Union of Agricultural Cooperatives and President of the Venice Growers Cooperative, and is a member of the Hellenic Agriculture Insurance Organization Board. We also have Mr. Andreas Karamanos with us, Professor Emeritus of the University of Athens and member of the Climate Change Effects Study Committee of the National Bank of Greece. And we also have Mr. Dimitris Lalas, Professor Emeritus of the University of Athens, former President Director of the Athens Planetarium. We'll start with the producers and cooperatives of producers, of farmers. And I'd like to ask Mr. Christos Giannakakis, how Greek farmers view climate change and what are the effects they suffer in the primary sector, in manufacturing, and the supply chain in general. Mr. Giannakakis. Can Mr. Giannakakis hear us? Mr. Giannakakis, can you hear us?
Θα αποκατασταθεί το πρόβλημα, οπότε θα συνεχίσω τη ροή με τον καθηγητή, με τον κύριο Λάλα. Κύριε καθηγητά, στη δημόσια σφαίρα
in the public realm, there are a lot of people who deny the climate change phenomenon. Can you describe the scientific grounds of climate change, and what are the climate parameters that you use in your various studies? Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. I would like to add a few information, give some input rather, regarding the climate change and how it affects all of us, especially our agricultural production. Responding to your question, I will have to highlight or underscore the major progress that has been achieved in the ways we can not actually forecast, like weather forecast, but estimate what will happen in the future over the horizon of decades. In the decade-long horizon, the current climate models date back to the 90s, 1990, and somebody was actually performing manual calculations back then. But currently, we can have got hypercomputers. The largest, actually, currently in Japan, covers an area of 1 football field and is used only for this reason, to run climate estimates. And there are also 30 groups around the world that perform these estimates using different models, different algorithms, and it is important that these calculations, these estimates are identical. There are major divergences between the various models. And the third, and equally impressively, we have managed to include a lot of weather phenomena and see how the atmosphere interacts with the ocean, how the different climate change interact with plants, and how plants affect influence the atmosphere, the air, and the vice versa. Most importantly, we can estimate the accuracy of these models by producing the weather as we know it. In other words, we can run simulations of the weather back in the 60s and back in the 90s and see how these models are doing, and they're doing indeed very well. Also, equally importantly, these models currently can because of the increase in the computing power, they can identify the parameters into a space area of 10 by 10 kilometers, which is very important for countries like Greece, which has got this intense relief and a lot of geographic particularities. And when I say that they can estimate what will happen in the future, project what will happen in the future, is that they can estimate day by day, the situation day by day for 30 years to come by estimating maximum and minimum temperatures per days, precipitation rate, snowfall, in order to be able to estimate the increase in the frequency of these phenomena. Therefore, we now have a very good estimate of what will happen in the future, a very good idea what will happen in the future. And these estimates can also be performed using various assumptions based on what we currently do. It was earlier said that we can estimate that based on what we do, we're going to reach a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees or 1.8 degrees Celsius. And we can say this with quite certainty based on our calculations, and this can take us to the next step and see what the effects of these new climate conditions will be in the future, the effects on agriculture specifically, and even more specifically in Larissa or in Arachova, very specific areas, very small areas. This is very important for the farming world, the agricultural world, to see what will happen in the future and take measures to tackle the effects. We're going to be important. Thank you, Mr. Lalas. And now I will turn to Mr. Giannakakis once again, because Mr. Lalas explained how climate engineers and scientists, natural scientists, perceive the phenomena and make their forecast. But how about you? How do scientists see the climate change?
Ας συνεχίσουμε με τον κύριο Καραμάνο. Έχουμε θέμα.
So, moving on with Mr. Karamanos, actually. Now, Professor, Mr. Karamanos, could you please explain, based on the evaluation impact assessment by the Bank of Greece on the climate change in Greece, which is also a point of reference. So, could you please explain to us whether all geographical areas are about to be impacted or affected in the same manner, and whether all crops are going to be affected in the same way? Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind invitation and to share with you some views on climate change impact in agriculture. So I will take up from where Mr. Lalas concluded, meaning that we do have the equipment and the scientific knowledge to be in a position to calculate with precision, I would say, what will be the impact based on the CO2 emission, so mild, moderate, severe scenarios. So based on various models, we worked, I would say, in detail in the frame of this Bank of Greece study, commissioned study, and we applied the various simulation models as regards the cultivation of crops. So given the climate, let's say, facts and figures for the future, and the crops, we have been able to corroborate that will be different levels of impact according to the specific geographic area in Greece, because Greece was our country of focus. So Greece is divided in different climate zones. And of course, the changes in the temperature also affect the plants' growth. And plants, of course, are affected by water resources sufficiency in the soil and also by the intensity of the weather phenomena. So for every different geographical zone, the impact was also different. Specifically, northern Greece, western Greece, Macedonian Thrace, are the areas in which the impact will be less negative or even positive in some cases. On the contrary, for southern Greece, the islands, and eastern Greece, the phenomena will negatively influence, which on average will be calculated at the level of 10 or 20% of the overall crop production. Of course, there are differences related to the specific plant species. So the increase in the concentration of the CO2, which is a constituent element at the level of climate change, and it can be important in the future, considerable, positively affects photosynthesis. So this is perhaps the only positive impact for the future. So the cultivations which absorb CO2 in a specific way are the cultivations which will receive a positive impact. And of course, equally positive will be the impact at the level of performance. There are other crops, such as corn crops, for instance, whereby the impact will not be so positive, and the overall consequences will be less positive or even negative for those crops. So those are the findings so far. Apparently, we have entered a phase during which we are proceeding with the review of the Bank of Greece study, which was initially published in 2011. And let's not forget that the facts and figures have changed ever since. Thank you very much, Mr. Karamanos. And now allow me to give the floor to Madame Kaliora. So moving on to the food chapter. So, Madam Kaliora, in a nutshell, briefly, what are the climate change impacts on the quality of food and agricultural products?
Mrs. Kaliora. Hello. I had issues with, I apologize, I had issues with the sound. After thanking you warmly for this invitation, could you please repeat your question, because I couldn't hear it? No problem whatsoever. I'm saying that agriculture is the key source of food for people, thanks to the products. As a special expert scientist, please explain the effects of the climate change, not on the quantity but quality of the crops that constitute our food. With regard to quantity, you must have already said that the extreme weather phenomena have got clear effects, and have led to the global famine. But when it comes to quality, and this actually might be a novel finding, there are meta-analyses of research indicating that we demonstrate that when we cultivate the foodstuff that are in conditions as the ones that are expected to be in 2050, with the increased CO2 and increased temperature, we observe that these food have got lower nutritional value in terms of protein and iron. Let me tell you that this has been demonstrated in foods such as oat and wheat and rice, but even in cases such as potatoes, where again we have got low iron content. This might sound peculiar because we haven't identified the exact mechanism that is related with this phenomenon, but we believe that thanks to the increased temperature and the greenhouse phenomenon, we have got an acceleration in the development, in the growth of these products, and therefore there's less biomass and less nutritional content. It is also important to say that this observation concerns three nutritional elements: zinc, protein, and iron, which are very important for human development, and affect key developmental stages of human beings, and are very important for good health condition in adults as well. And it's important to say that we're talking about three macronutrients and nutrients where that a lot of population seems to suffer from deficiency. So if this scenario proves to be true in future, then we'll have a major issue with deficiency in specific nutrients in the food crops. Thank you, Mrs. Kallora, for this novel information and insights that you shared with us. And I'm coming back to our discussion round, and I'd like to ask Mr. Lalas the following. I have read your very interesting paper of 2017, which was financed by Piraeus Bank as well, regarding the effects of climate change on agriculture. What impressed me is the financial aspect of the effects. Can you briefly talk us through this? Yes, gladly so. As an introduction, I'd like to state some of the parameters of this research, because these are important in order to interpret the results. We looked into 10 different crops: corn, rye, wheat, rice, olives, vineyards, various vegetables, and fruit. We studied the entire territory of Greece. We looked into the latest data regarding the development of the climate in the future, and we also reviewed how we also considered how one might act in order to mitigate the effects of the climate change. Now, what do climate models tell us about the future? There's going to be an increase of the average temperature by 4 or 5 or 6 degrees, and a decrease in the precipitation or rate by approximately 20%. Plus minus some tolerance value. So this is a given. Now, what we did with my colleagues from the planetarium, who also took part in this study performed on behalf of the Piraeus Bank, we looked into all these climate data, and we tried to measure the decrease in production, and then work out the cost of these new conditions. A round figure, €160 million decrease per year. This is the income from the farming income. And this is the mild scenario. There is a worst case scenario, but this is the average scenario, the moderate scenario. The next question was, what can we do about this? And what we can do is to use more or less fertilizers, change the timing of the crop management, use more or less water, use new technologies. All these capabilities are available in order to mitigate the climate change effects. And we examined the cost of all these alternatives. We also took into consider the benefit from the higher concentrations of CO2 on production. And considering the cost of these interventions, we deduced that if some of these interventions actually are affected, the cost of the impact on agricultural production may even not only may be reduced, but also turn for the better, so gain a benefit. So let me note, additionally, that what we also examined is whether the models used for this study give good results accurate results. What did we do? We took a culture of the 60s and 70s, and we simulated how these models and see how they can reproduce production in the future. And we saw that the results were accurate, so we're quite firm about our estimates, quite certain about our estimates. And these adaptation actions that I mentioned earlier, including the change in the hybrid, change in the crops, in order to have a wide range of actions that can be taken in the future in order to reduce the negative effects of the new climate conditions in the future.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Λάλα. Κύριε Καραμάνο.
Thank you. Mr. Karamanos? At the level of climate change, we have discussed what are the approaches vis-à-vis the atmosphere, the various model systems at the level of plant growth. But from you, what I would like is for you to describe or to say a few words as regards the soil and the land resources, since now we are also discussing new trends in agriculture, such as regenerative agriculture. So what are the estimates as regards the productivity and the performance at the level of the land in each area? Well, yes. Based on various estimates, we have seen that the element of soil is not a parameter that is taken into account. And of course, if we take into account the new orientation, hydroponic production, the soil parameter is a key one. So despite the new trends, the soil as a critical factor can never be, let's say, overlooked. Now, our country has various areas which run the risk of desertification. Many studies have been made which involve the country, and there are maps which are very telling as regards the risks against desertification, the quality of the soil, and so forth. Of course, the risk is higher in coastal agricultural systems, as well as in areas where there are considerable heights. Of course, the coastal areas will be most affected due to the forecasted rising of the sea level. So there will be a penetration of sea water in this soil, which will affect the agricultural system. So it will be as an effect, we will have the salination of the soils. However, at the same time, there will be an corrosion of those soils. In a recent study, which involves the region of Thessaly, it has been established that approximately 24% of the non-flat lands in Thessaly, the slopes in Thessaly will be changed, and approximately 7% of those lands will be useless for crops due to the salination of those lands. So we need to adopt an systemic approach in order to avert this risk as regards the land, because this is an irreversible resource as regards agriculture. So measures to sustainably manage those lands, and of course measures to deal with the salination problems in order not to have reduced lands available for agricultural production. Because, of course, if we have smaller quantities of available lands for agriculture, of course, the overall agricultural production will also be diminished. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Karamanos, for your input and this new information that you shared with us. Allow me to go back to Madam Kaliora. Can you hear us, Madam Kaliora? Yes. I would like to raise a question. recently, and we see that there are many new trends as regards food and dietary habits with new products on the shelf. What is this dietary model, which is the most resilient one vis-à-vis climate change and with the softest environmental footprint?
First of all, I'd like to tell you that all the nutritional models that include animal products are related with high greenhouse gas emissions. So they've got worse footprint than the diets that are based on vegetables. So one can consider that any diet proposal, any diet pattern in which we reduce meat consumption, we have got major contribution and a good response to climate change. But it's not as simple. It's not simple to discuss the environmental footprint of specific food elements, nutritional elements, but talk about the but we should have rather a holistic approach to the diet footprint, because otherwise we might end up with a diet that might have a low environmental footprint but may not be healthy enough, or may be healthy but have a high environmental footprint, or be unhealthy and have a high environmental footprint. So looking at the various diet patterns in their entirety, it is certain that the Mediterranean diet, the diet that reminds us of the diet that the Greeks had back in the 60s, the best, the ideal, the most sustainable diet pattern. We're talking about a system based on cereals, fruit and vegetables, rare consumption of fish, and even rarer consumption of meat, a food system that has been established as the best plant-based diet pattern with a lot of benefits for human health. It is certain that when it comes to environment, climate change, this pattern is the one that can best respond to all the concerns that we have regarding nutrition and food. One must, regarding the Mediterranean diet, we should focus on 4 key characteristics. First of all, low meat and animal product consumption. This is the key the top characteristic. So low methane emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. Also low water footprint. For instance, in order to produce veal in such quantities as to generate 1 calorie, we need 40 liters of water. In order to have pulses, a quantity of pulses that provide 1 calorie, we need only 4 liters of water. So one may realize how smaller the footprint of plant-based food is. And other characteristics of the Mediterranean diet, which is the ideal pattern, are that it preserves earth, because 75% of our agricultural land, farming land, is used to produce animal-based products, which account only for 17% of the calories that humans need to take in. So we use much more land in order to produce meat and animal products, whereas in the Mediterranean diet, which is plant-based, we need less land. Another key characteristic is that there are elements like pulses that need no fertilizers. So we're talking about a reduced need for fertilizers because they absorb natrium from air and they maintain the land healthy for the next crop thanks to the release of natrium into the soil. So this diet has got involves some traditional farming practices. Let's not forget there are some small family farms. There is a lot of variety, diversity in terms of products. We've got more than 30,000 species of plants. So the Mediterranean diet can be a response to climate change that should be safeguarded, and it is there that we should return, as it was initially said in the beginning of the 60s. So we should recall the essential Mediterranean diet of the 60s. So, Mrs. Kalliotra, the Mediterranean diet, apart from being more healthier, it is more environmentally friendly. Exactly. So we heard the expert science talking to us about the climate, the food, and the agriculture. And now let's try and talk with Mr. Giannakakis. Can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Mr. Giannakakis, as we said earlier, is the president of the Hellenic Agricultural Insurance, member of the board of the Hellenic Agricultural Insurance Organization, president of the National Union of Agricultural Cooperatives, and president of the Venus Growers Cooperative. Mr. Giannakakis, please tell us how Greek farmers perceive climate change in their daily life and how you feel it there in Veria.
So not only in Veria, but in Greece overall, across the country. So based on data since 2011, we observe a gradual but stable rise at the level of damages. So there is a considerable issue, not only at the level of the revenues of the farmers, and to a certain extent we try to set off for those losses via the Hellenic Agricultural Insurance Organization. Except from that, there is an overall impact at the level of the agricultural system. So the manufacturing plants, the export units, any other, let's say, productive activity around agriculture. So based on the facts and figures that we have available, allow me to share my screen with you in order for you to see the detailed data. So we can see the slide, says the moderator. So this is the Central Macedonia land, and this is during the blooming period, mid-March and April. So indeed, this is like a picture from heaven. So this was taken back in 2017, 2018, another picture during the year, and this, let's say, maturation period of the products, we had intense precipitations. So you see what is the final product. Everything has fallen off the trees on the soil. Now, based on ELGA statistics and the compensations, ever since 2012, there is a gradual increase at the level of compensations and support to the farmers. So those damages which accounted for 56 million in 2011, have skyrocketed to 196 million in 2019. Needless to say that in 2020 and 21, the damages in the aftermath of the various weather phenomena exceeded the 250 million euros. So this is a huge problem at the level of sustainability and viability, rather, of ELGA, of the fund. Therefore, its ability to compensate the farmers due to the weather phenomena. And if you deduct as well the 30 million euros which account for the various operational expenses, you realize that ELGA actually would go further down drain unless we didn't have the Greek state, which came in support and injected, let's say, cash flows at the level of the organization. So we need to continue to support our farmers. However, on the other hand, we need to be able to ensure the viability of the system. So what we have seen due to the climate change is that we're not faced with problems due to the drought, but problems due to the fact that we have very intense and extraordinary precipitations. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we had precipitation during the cultivation of the cotton crops. So the farmers were not able, let's say, to have access to their crops and harvest the cotton. A few days ago, we had a heat wave, northern Greece and in Crete as well. Another month ago, once again, precipitation. During the springtime, we had freezing temperature, which destroyed fruit crops, such as tangerines and prunes. So two problems. On the one hand, support the farmers imminently, and second, the trading potential for those products was reduced. And third, the projects that were saved actually disappeared from the shelf. The prices, of course, doubled or tripled. And as a result, however, because the supply could not meet demand, the farmers opted for selling off their products at much higher prices, not via the formal channels, but in the grey economy. So you have traders which enter Greece as well in a certain way illegally from the northern borders of Greece, Bulgaria and elsewhere. So what they do is that they purchase the products and the labor cost is very low. So the aftermath and the side effects, it's not only that the revenues of farmers are affected, but this is to a certain extent compensated by way of set-off by ELGA, the organization. However, the most important is that the side effect that is an attack to the organized trading system or organized trade. Furthermore, on the onset of production and during the production, there are damages, of course, due to the weather phenomena or harsh weather phenomena. There are also damages due to global warming and increase in temperature. So tree plantations do not, let's say, grow with and absorbing the adequate minimum levels of cold weather or cold temperature hours during the winter, which is 0 to 7 degrees Celsius. If the hours of cold are not to the level of the minimum hours required, then, and you have higher temperatures instead, you have a reduction in the production of the crops. So you see that, for example, of fruit plantations, due to the fact that the minimum hours of fresh temperature is not taking place, then the fruits do not become ripe or mature. So this is one major problem. And we have had, of course, the possibility to have a specific crop protection aircraft flying over the plains of Thessaly, for example, or Macedonia. However, the number of aircraft was not sufficient, and therefore it was not adequately protected. A couple of weeks ago, we paid a visit to France, Bordeaux, and we see that there were specific balloons spraying off some metal elements, and they spray iode silver in order for clouds bearing hail to be transformed into clouds bearing rain or precipitation. And that was a very informative experience for us. So, all those anti-hail equipment and measures are very important. However, at the same time, we have made efforts to see how the financing the sector or the financial sector can support the farmers. So we have received over 34 million requests from farmers in order to be supported by such schemes. And so, at the same time, we have initiated various, let's say, experiments, and we apply specific elements in order to protect our crops and protect them against hail or freezing conditions and so forth. And we will continue to do so. We have also requested from Israel, from an irrigation company, to dispatch to us bags and equipment spraying droplets of water that would, let's say, shape or, let's say, produce, like in an igloo-shaped bubble of ice around the tree that would act in a protective manner against freezing temperatures. So if the temperature falls below a certain level, the tree would be protected. So in an active manner, we need to support and finance those actions to protect our production, because the idea is to safeguard the entire production system, because even if there are compensations for the farmers, it will never be enough given the radical increase of damages incurred. So we need to come up with resources without being faced with problems and complaints on behalf of the European Commission. Thank you.
Mr. Giannakakis, you were very concise. You provide us with abundant new information. I'm not going to ask a second question because your response was very comprehensive, and unfortunately we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you all warmly. I believe that this panel included a lot of useful and novel information regarding the effects of climate change on agriculture and the agri-food sector at large, agri-food system at large. Then Mr. Papadakis will take the floor now in order to sum up today's sessions. Thank you very much.
Γεια σας.
Hello, dear friends, once again. After a very interesting, or rather several interesting panel discussions, we received a lot of information and insights, and I'll try to sum up somehow the most important and prepare you for tomorrow. First of all, we heard Mr. Zanis, who documented and gave specific data on and explained what defines the climate change. The next panel specifically talked about the measures that our state needs to take or intends to take vis-à-vis the climate change. We had the Secretary General of the Ministry of the Environment, Mr. Aravosis, who talked about the climate law. He talked about the national targets, the new climate law, the national targets, and the measures that the government intends to take for climate adjustment, climate adaptation, the roadmap for the economy, resource and waste management in order to achieve zero waste. Mr. Baginetas, on behalf of the Ministry of Agriculture, Rural Development and Food, talked about the measures to be taken by the Ministry regarding agriculture, and specifically regarding emissions, the participation of agriculture in the climate change, and the measures to mitigate the effects of the climate change on agriculture. And as he promised, we are looking forward to the National Strategic Plan that will soon be put in consultation and later will be tabled at the Parliament. We heard Mr. Chaniotis on behalf of the European Commission, giving us all the information regarding the European Union, the European Commission strategy on and the common agricultural policy and how agriculture can be adjusted to climate change and what the role of agriculture will be in reducing emissions and the effects on climate change. And the measures taken by the European Commission, very important measures with a lot of financing that will also be allocated to Greek farmers in order to achieve these changes. Mrs. Koudouri talked about the COP26 and how the finance sector and the finances see positively new technologies and the possibilities we have, or rather the financing facilities that are in place in order to finance new technologies to mitigate climate change using renewable energy sources, circular economy technologies, and the like, and other similar measures, rather. Mr. Manzaris was very concise, but he gave a very decisive talk regarding what Greece has achieved in the recent years, and not only with the implementation of new technologies, but also in the direction of emission reduction. We have achieved a lot. We have reduced our emissions significantly, but unfortunately we're still lagging behind compared to the EU average. In the second session, we heard Mr. Morris on behalf of the FAO giving us a very good perspective of the global role of agriculture in climate change and the opportunities that there are for farmers, agriculture, and the economy at large, thanks to these measures that can mitigate emissions and create new perspectives for sustainable agriculture. In the next panel, Mr. Lalas, responding to the questions of Mr. Vouloudakis, informed us about the vast potential, vast capabilities that scientists have thanks to technology to estimate climate change quite accurately and to project what is in stock for us. Mr. Karamanos, on the other hand, talked about the effects that climate change may have on agriculture, specifically in Greece, based on studies that have been performed, the first one financed by the Bank of Greece. The negative and positive effects of climate change on agriculture due to the increase in temperature and decrease in water availability. Mrs. Kalliora, from her point of view, talked about the effect of climate change on food and gave us shared a lot of interesting views regarding the adaptation of our nutritional habits and dietary habits based on the climate change, and stressed that we should not be talking about food with low environmental footprint, but healthy diet and a diet that has got an overall low environmental footprint. And she concluded that the Mediterranean diet helps not only our health, but it also helps mitigate climate change. Finally, Mr. Giannakakis, on the part of the farmers, gave us a lot of recent and interesting data on the evolution of the climate change effects on Greek agriculture sector, taking stock of the damages caused by climate change, the various because of the intensity of the weather phenomena and the increased rainfall, and demonstrated how the past 10 years agriculture and the national economy have been experiencing the climate change. A lot of insights, a lot of information that we received on this first day. And let's see what's in stock for us tomorrow. So tomorrow, we have got the first session on food systems and climate change. Our conference will start at 6 in the evening. We have got a lot of Greek and foreign speakers from the academia, from the business community, Greek and multinational businesses, companies, and there's going to be a very interesting discussion regarding food, agri-food, and in the second session, we're going to focus on the climate change market, the food products with neutral climate footprint. But again, we are going to have Greek and foreign speakers. So see you tomorrow at 6 for the second day of our conference. Have a good evening.